In the last video, we explored how this cognitive function appears in the conscious mind through the hero, parent, child, and inferior functions. But the story doesn't end there. The same cognitive function also exists in the shadow. It doesn't become a different function. It simply becomes less conscious, less trusted, and often reveals itself in very different ways. Let's take a look. Part 1. The function in the shadow. In Part 1, we explored extroverted intuition in its conscious positions, where the function can be deliberately accessed, trusted, and developed as part of a person's normal way of engaging with the world. But when extroverted intuition moves into the shadow, the function itself doesn't suddenly become something different. What changes is the person's relationship with it. Extroverted intuition becomes less conscious, less trusted, and more difficult to use deliberately. Instead of feeling like a natural mental process, it may show up more reactively, especially when someone is under stress, dealing with conflict, or pushed outside of their usual way of thinking. And because extroverted intuition is concerned with possibilities, alternatives, connections, and what could happen next, its shadow expressions often revolve around uncertainty. The same ability to see possibilities can become a source of doubt, suspicion, criticism, confusion, or even psychological overload. This is why shadow extroverted intuition shouldn't automatically be understood as bad extroverted intuition. The function is still doing what extroverted intuition does. It's still looking beyond what is immediately obvious and considering what else might be possible. The difference is that the person may no longer feel fully in control of that process. As we move through the four shadow positions, we'll see that relationship change in stages. First, extroverted intuition can become something we worry about, then something we criticize, then something we struggle to understand, and finally, under extreme pressure, something that can emerge in a much more intense and disruptive form. Part 2. Nemesis Function. The nemesis position of extroverted intuition is associated with the INFJ and INTJ types. Here, extroverted intuition can become a source of worry and insecurity. The important thing to understand is that this isn't simply a fear of possibilities. It's a heightened awareness that there may be possibilities the person hasn't considered, connections they haven't noticed, or outcomes they haven't prepared for. When this relationship becomes activated, the mind can become unusually sensitive to the possibility that something unexpected is coming. Imagine you've carefully planned how a project is supposed to go. Normally, you might feel comfortable with that plan. But then someone points out three different ways it could fail, or introduces a completely unexpected variable. Suddenly, your attention shifts toward everything that could go wrong. You start thinking, what if this happens? And if that happens, what does that lead to? That's extroverted intuition operating through insecurity. Instead of possibilities feeling exciting or useful, they can feel like threats that need to be accounted for. This can create defensiveness as well. Someone might become suspicious of new ideas because they immediately notice how those ideas could create complications. A change that another person sees as an opportunity might instead trigger questions about what it could disrupt, what consequences haven't been considered, or what hidden problem might appear later. And because extroverted intuition naturally generates alternatives, the nemesis position can make a person feel as though there is always another possibility waiting around the corner. They may double-check plans, anticipate unexpected objections, mentally prepare for several outcomes, or become unusually alert to changes in their environment. The irony is that these behaviors can sometimes be genuinely useful. Thinking ahead can prevent problems, and noticing alternative possibilities can make someone remarkably prepared. But when extroverted intuition is experienced primarily through insecurity, the process becomes less about exploration and more about protection. Instead of asking, what else could be possible, the underlying question becomes, what am I missing? And that question can be difficult to turn off. When this relationship becomes more critical rather than simply defensive, we move into the critic position. Part 3. Critic Function. The critic position of extroverted intuition is associated with the ENFJ and ENTJ types. Here, the function can become highly critical, both toward the person themselves and toward the possibilities being presented to them. Rather than simply worrying that another possibility exists, the person may become frustrated with the way possibilities are being generated in the first place. Too many options can feel inefficient, unfocused, or unnecessarily complicated. The mind may start evaluating possibilities according to whether they are useful, realistic, coherent, or worth pursuing. This can create a kind of perfectionism around possibilities. Someone might think, if we're going to consider another option, it better actually improve the situation. They may become irritated when people constantly introduce new ideas without following through, change direction repeatedly, or generate possibilities that seem disconnected from the actual problem. But the criticism can also turn inward. A person may look back at a decision and think about all the alternatives they failed to recognize. They might criticize themselves for not seeing another possibility earlier, for overlooking an obvious connection, or for committing to one course of action before considering every relevant alternative. This can produce a strange contradiction. The person may dislike excessive possibilities while simultaneously feeling that they should have anticipated more of them. For example, imagine someone makes a decision that doesn't work out. In hindsight, they can suddenly see several other paths they could have taken. Instead of simply accepting that the outcome was uncertain, they may think, I should have seen this coming. There were other options. Why didn't I think of them? That's where criticism becomes particularly powerful. Extroverted intuition is being used to identify alternatives, but instead of opening the mind, those alternatives become evidence against the quality of a decision. The same thing can happen when evaluating other people. Someone may become frustrated with a person who keeps changing plans, jumping between ideas, or constantly proposing new possibilities without settling on one. The criticism isn't necessarily about creativity itself, it's about the feeling that possibilities should lead somewhere. At its best, this shadow relationship can develop into a useful ability to challenge weak ideas. It can force someone to ask whether an exciting possibility actually has substance behind it. But when taken too far, every new possibility can become something to attack, dismiss, or hold to an impossibly high standard. And that brings us to an even more complicated relationship with extroverted intuition, the trickster. Part 4. Trickster Function. The trickster position of extroverted intuition is associated with the ISFP and ISTP types. Here, extroverted intuition can become something of a blind spot. The difficulty isn't necessarily that the person can't generate possibilities. It's that they may have trouble recognizing what extroverted intuition is actually doing, especially when multiple possibilities begin interacting with one another. This can create confusion around situations where the meaning isn't immediately obvious. Someone might see an event and understand what is happening right now, but have difficulty anticipating where the situation could lead, or recognizing that one seemingly unrelated development might connect to another, and this can produce mixed signals. A person may notice a possibility one moment and completely dismiss it the next. They might make an assumption about how something will develop, only to discover that there were several other interpretations they hadn't considered. For example, imagine someone receives a vague message from a friend. The message could mean several different things, but instead of naturally exploring those possibilities, the person settles on one interpretation. Later, they discover the friend meant something completely different. The problem wasn't a lack of intelligence or awareness. The difficulty was recognizing how many plausible interpretations were present in the first place. The trickster position can also create unintended consequences. A person may act on what seems like a straightforward situation without realizing that their action opens up several other possibilities. Then, when those consequences appear, the situation can feel strangely confusing or unfair. It's almost as though extroverted intuition is operating just outside the person's normal field of awareness. Other people may see the branching possibilities clearly, while the person experiencing the trickster position may wonder why everyone is making the situation so complicated. And because this function is less trusted, attempts to use it consciously can sometimes make things worse. The person may overcorrect by trying to imagine every possible interpretation, only to become overwhelmed by conflicting possibilities. This is why the trickster position can feel so slippery. It's not simply a lack of imagination. It's difficulty knowing when to trust possibilities, which possibilities matter, and how different possibilities relate to one another. Over time, greater awareness can make this blind spot easier to recognize. But when the psychological pressure becomes extreme enough, extroverted intuition can move beyond being merely confusing and become something far more intense. That brings us to the demon position. Part 5. Demon Function. The demon position of extroverted intuition is associated with the ESFP and ESTP types. Here, extroverted intuition tends to remain relatively hidden until a person is under extreme psychological pressure. Under ordinary circumstances, the person may have little reason to consciously engage with extroverted intuition. But when their usual methods of dealing with the world stop working, the function can suddenly emerge with much greater intensity. Instead of simply noticing a few alternative possibilities, the mind may begin generating them rapidly. Every action can seem to lead to another outcome, every problem can appear to have multiple hidden causes, and every situation can suddenly seem connected to something else. Under severe stress, this can become destructive. The person may start imagining worst-case scenarios, making connections that aren't particularly reliable, or reacting to possibilities as though they are already facts. A situation that was previously concrete and manageable can become psychologically enormous because the mind keeps expanding it into everything that could happen next. For example, imagine someone experiences a major failure. Instead of dealing only with what actually happened, their mind begins racing through every possible consequence. What if this happens again? What if that ruins something else? What if this means something much bigger is wrong? What if everything they've been relying on is about to change? The possibilities become difficult to separate from reality. This is one reason the demon position can feel so foreign. Extroverted intuition isn't simply being used in a less effective way. It can feel like an entirely different mental atmosphere, one where the number of possibilities keeps expanding faster than the person can evaluate them. But even here, the function itself hasn't changed. Extroverted intuition is still doing what it naturally does, exploring alternatives, recognizing connections, and looking beyond the immediate situation. The problem is that the person is accessing this process under conditions where trust, control, and psychological stability are already strained. And that also means the demon position isn't necessarily doomed to remain destructive. With greater self-awareness, a person can learn to recognize when they are being pulled into this extreme pattern of possibility generation. They can separate what is actually happening from what might happen, slow down the chain of associations, and allow other people or more grounded parts of themselves to help evaluate those possibilities. In some cases, this can even become an unexpected source of resilience. The variability that once produced overwhelming possibilities can eventually help someone realize that a crisis isn't limited to one outcome. If there are multiple ways a situation can go wrong, there may also be multiple ways it can be repaired. And that is the strange potential hidden inside the demon position. Even when extroverted intuition emerges at its most extreme, it is still the same function. What changes is the person's relationship with it, and with enough awareness, even a function that once felt threatening can become something they are capable of understanding, navigating, and eventually using when they need it most. By now, hopefully you've seen that this cognitive function never actually changed. Even in the Nemesis, Critic, Trickster, and Demon functions, it remained the same underlying cognitive process. What changed was the person's relationship with it. Rather than being trusted and consciously relied upon, it became less conscious, less trusted, and often revealed itself during moments of stress, insecurity, or psychological pressure. Understanding the shadow isn't about labeling parts of yourself as good or bad. It's about recognizing that every cognitive function has both conscious and unconscious expressions, and that becoming aware of them is an important step toward understanding both yourself and others.